This idea of Jesus as shepherd can and does sometimes fall into kind of merely a pastoral, you might say, that everything is sweetness, with Jesus. And if we think of Psalm 23, some interpret it that way. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I'll be in green pastures beside restful waters, etc. But clearly that's not meant as to be the nature of our life here on earth. We can interpret it in a certain way, but clearly people, those who follow God on earth are going to experience trials, right? Difficulties, suffering. As we read as we heard in the second reading, who are these people? They're the ones who survived the great tribulation. Great distress, I think, maybe it was in this translation. So those who follow Jesus are going to experience distress, And Jesus says, no one can take them out of my hand. Why would he say that unless there was somebody trying to take them out of his hand? Satan is trying always to take us out of Jesus' hand. And these, in the book of Revelation, the reading that we heard, carrying the palm branch. The palm is a symbol of the martyrs. And so we know from reality that those who follow Jesus have difficulties and sufferings, right? Jesus himself says, those who follow me must take up their cross, deny themselves, follow me. And that's a key, I think, to understanding this idea of shepherd. So we know, first of all, the martyrs have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb, right? They've suffered with Christ. But Augustine, among others, says in one of his sermons that there are some martyrs who are martyrs in their beds. And what he means is some who suffer the sick. Some martyrs die in their beds, not on a cross or in a Roman praetorium or something. How do they do that? It's because they've accepted their suffering and difficulty as from God, as their cross. They've taken it as a cross. The cross doesn't mean just suffering, but the cross means suffering that has been given to them by God, either actively or passively allowed. And we understand that about God's will. God's will is not just what God actively gives us to take on, to do, but that he allows. And clearly, God allows evil. God allows suffering. But think of this. The very words, God allows it, means that, in a sense, is the words I use, it's passed through God first. Nothing happens to us that has not passed through God first, or even come from God. And even as I speak about this, just to be honest, I'm still working on this myself to accept this completely. I'm still trying to really get it from my head down into my heart. And it seems to me those who are not necessarily martyrs can become martyrs you might say quote-unquote martyrs, or in a small m, so to speak, by accepting whatever comes to them as coming from God and offering it with Christ. I've been reading finally. The book has sat on my shelf for years, and I've begun it more than once and never really got anywhere. I guess you read books when it's time to read them. But I've been reading Father Walter Chiswick's He Leadeth Me. And if you're struggling with suffering or trying to figure out God's will or that kind of thing, I recommend this book to you highly. But Father Walter Chiswick was a Jesuit priest who was trained. He felt a call to serve in Soviet Russia. This is in the 30s. He was trained. He didn't get there really. He only got as far as Poland when World War II started. And the Soviets invaded Poland, captured him, decided he was a Vatican spy. And so he spent 5 years in Lubyanka prison. One of the most, really maybe the most infamous prison in our modern history, certainly. Spent mostly in interrogations and torture and isolation. And as he struggles to figure out, okay, what's God's will here for me, or how do I do God's will here? It comes to him that this is God's will, the 24 hours that God gives him that day. The people that will come into his life, the experiences he will have. It's not where is God's will in this, but this itself is God's will. That God has allowed this to come to him. And so what is up to him is to accept it or fight it. And accept it doesn't mean you just say, okay, this is great. Sometimes the evil that comes to us must be fought, right? Sometimes it must be endured. But always what he realizes is it must be accepted as from God. And then what we do with it is how we follow God's will. What we do with it is how we offer it with Jesus. And then he spends the next 18 years in a gulag. So he spends 23 years in the Soviet Union as a prisoner. And he comes to this place that I'm still trying to get to, is that what's God's will? What's right in front of him? That God allows different things for different people based, who knows what, on God's plan. And how we receive it, how we live it, what we do with it, whether we fight it and complain and argue and whatever else, whether we try to avoid it, or whether we receive it and then offer it back to God with Christ, is how we follow or don't follow God's will. And really, he doesn't use this term, but in this context of this Mass, what he really does then is try to unite himself to Jesus and let Jesus shepherd him. We see that there will be a point where those who follow Jesus are brought to a place where there are no more tears, are brought to a place where their labors are finished, where they celebrate and worship God, where their robes are washed clean. But what we see is Jesus, there's no way around suffering, whether it's some kind of persecution because we're Christians, or just this is life, right? It comes to everyone, illness and grief and misunderstanding and whatever, old age and dying, etc. But whatever comes to us is what God has allowed to come to us. And Jesus won't shepherd us around it, or over it, or under it. He will, if we allow him, if we give ourselves to him, shepherd us to glory, eternal life, and peace, but it comes by shepherding us through our suffering. So let's not think of Jesus shepherding us. What that means is that we won't experience suffering and difficulty, but that He will lead us through it to eternal peace, to eternal life, to eternal happiness.